Thank you very much, and good morning, Honorable Attorney General and Minister for the Economy, Civil Service and Communications, members of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Resident Coordinator, distinguished panelists, colleagues and friends. On behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Office for the Pacific, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this first regional forum on business and human rights in the Pacific. It is very encouraging to see so many stakeholders from different backgrounds here to advance human rights and online with us also in this forum. Over the next 2 days, we will be hearing from governments, international organizations, independent national institutions, eminent business practitioners, development partners, civil society, and human rights defenders. They will share their experiences of the opportunities and challenges that the Pacific faces. And they will provide examples of good, sustainable business practices and how these reflect the standards that have been set by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. OHCHR is delighted to organize this meeting jointly with the Human Rights Council's independent working group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises, or in short, the Human Rights and Business Working Group. I'm also pleased to be joined on this panel by our high-level speakers. And let me start by saying that in every region of the world, business and the private sector have the power to create positive human rights change. They provide livelihoods and jobs, they contribute to social cohesion, and they provide essential services, including during humanitarian and other crises. Thus, they can be an integral part of creating a stable, inclusive, and democratic society. The Pacific region enjoys all of these benefits, and yet it also continues to experience significant challenges in addressing adverse impacts, human rights impacts of business activities, especially those related to extractive industries, to fishing, and infrastructure. Individuals and communities across the Pacific have experienced growing inequality, forced displacement, environmental pollution, labor rights abuses, and the loss of traditional knowledge and biodiversity. The Pacific region is also disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, which directly and indirectly threatens human rights. But businesses can play a central role in addressing these challenges. Business can contribute to innovations and to solutions to prevent, mitigate, and adapt to climate change and its adverse impacts. It can help to avert climate harms and ensure climate justice, and business enterprises must be part of the solution in the Pacific. As much of the CO2 emissions which cause climate change derive from business-driven economic activity, it is essential that governments engage with businesses to ensure human rights and environmental due diligence. But it is through joint human rights-based engagement by all stakeholders, including the business sector, that we can be set on a course to meet the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement, whose 5th anniversary we will be celebrating on the 12th of December. States' obligations under international human rights law and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights provide the authoritative global framework. Any legal and policy responses to human rights implications that involve businesses should be aligned with these UN guiding principles. Our Office for the Pacific and the UN Human Rights Working Group on Business and Human Rights, in collaboration with other partners, have been organizing several events in the past 2 years here in this region, especially in Fiji and in Papua New Guinea, to raise awareness about business and human rights issues and standards, and to build the capacity of various stakeholders. The Pacific, however, remains the only region in the world not to have any state committed to develop a national action plan on business and human rights. It is our hope that this first regional forum will create momentum and that we will soon see a Pacific state to produce a national action plan in a collaborative manner based on the principles of inclusion of all voices. We stand ready to support any state that wishes to do so. Distinguished members of the audience, COVID-19 was a health emergency that rapidly developed into an economic crisis with very significant social implications on all societies. It has had devastating effects for the Pacific, hitting those who are already in challenging situations. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities and discrimination, and it has led to new vulnerabilities. But it also gives us the opportunity to build a future of greater shared values, greater shared security and prosperity, where human rights are at the heart of business models that build back better. To address these systemic inequalities, state actions in response to COVID-19 should include strengthening worker protections and labor rights. They should increase social safety nets for formal and informal workers and their families, and they should expand revenue to fund enhanced social protection, address tax injustices, and last but not least, rectify gender inequalities in the world of work. Businesses should also seek to fully embed respect for human rights throughout their operations and ensure sustainable practices across value chains. In line with the Sustainable Development Goals, global partnerships through the sharing of resources, including vaccines, knowledge and visionary thinking should help create new systems to transition to a more sustainable future. Over the next 2 days, we will be holding panel discussions in areas such as building back better after COVID, the gender dimensions of businesses and human rights, modern slavery and other labor rights issues in supply chains, and protecting the rights of indigenous people, to name just a few of the topics of these sessions. And I'm particularly pleased to see so many female and young experts here and young people joining us online also at the First Pacific Forum. It's essential that we have platforms for women entrepreneurs, women community leaders, human rights defenders, and state representatives whose voices must be heard on an equal footing with men in this region. And as young people today are demanding, it is time to move beyond short-term economic goals and to create sustainability, valuing the environment and respect for human rights as an important part of our lives. We have over 270 individuals registered for our forum, and I believe that there's quite a number of them already online here for our opening today, which just goes to show how much of an interest there is in the Pacific. So I thank you all for participating in today's forum, and once again, welcome to our high-level panel. It is now my great pleasure to give the floor and to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Anita Ramasastry, who is the chairperson of the Working Group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises. Anita is joining us online from Washington State in the US. She has been leading in her work as chairperson the work of the working group in areas such as anti-corruption and businesses in conflict-affected regions, working with states to ensure action to protect and uphold human rights. So Anita, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heike, for the kind introduction. Mr. Attorney General, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues and friends, greetings from the Pacific Northwest and Seattle. Being on the west coast of the US, residents of my state look towards the Pacific and consider ourselves part of the Pacific Rim. Our future is very much intertwined with that of the Pacific region, and we have many residents here who come from Pacific nations. I'm honored to deliver some brief remarks today at the first UN Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights. I address you in my capacity as chair of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, a group of 5 independent experts from different regions appointed by the Human Rights Council. First, I would like to congratulate my working group colleague from Asia, who's in Hong Kong, Surya Dev, for his efforts to launch this forum in collaboration with the Office of the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR. I am pleased that this important dialogue is taking place despite the current challenging circumstances with the global COVID-19 pandemic. The working group's ambition is to support regional races to the top among governments and business. We want to drive responsible business conduct that respects people and the planet. We've already established platforms for multi-stakeholder dialogue and peer learning in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And last week, we were part of the first regional forum for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, led by the United Nations Development Program. As highlighted in the material for this forum, flowing from a dedicated regional dialogue session at the annual UN Forum in Geneva last year, Pacific countries face a number of challenges connected to the impacts of business, such as disproportionate impacts of climate change, unsustainable tourism, exploitation of migrant workers, gender-based discrimination, unsustainable natural resource exploitation, corruption, and barriers for rights holders in accessing remedy when harms occur. Pacific countries face particular capacity challenges to address the governance gaps that are at the root of these problems. This is where business and human rights and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights play a critical role, as they highlight the respective duties and responsibilities of governments and business to safeguard people at risk of adverse impacts connected to business. In terms of government roles, they also highlight both host and home state duties. The essence of the UN guiding principles is that it is critical for business to identify the harms it is causing, contributing to, or linked to, and then to work to prevent and remedy them. This is the biggest challenge. We need to ensure that business is not done at a cost to people's lives and well-being. The working group is itself just coming out of another major event, the annual UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, which took place 2 weeks ago. Normally it's held in Geneva, but this year it was virtual. This year's annual UN Forum had the theme, Preventing Business-Related Human Rights Abuses, the key to a sustainable future for people and planet. That was the working group's key message at the Global Forum. The UN guiding principles are a key tool for prevention of negative human rights impacts as a result are essential to a strategy for a resilient recovery. Let me highlight some key messages from the Global Forum that seem relevant for your discussions today. First, the UN guiding principles are a guidepost in times of crisis. We face many crises now and ahead, including the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, and the crisis of continued racism across the world. These challenges have shown the fragility of systems that do not put people's fundamental welfare and dignity at the center. Second, our future is increasingly one of mandatory measures. We now have a strong evidence base telling us that voluntary measures aren't getting us where we need to be. Trade unions, civil society groups, and others have tirelessly advocated for binding measures at the national, regional, and international levels. Companies and investors increasingly agree, calling for unified approaches that level the playing field. There is broad agreement that mandatory measures should be based on the UN guiding principles, and rights holders should have seats at the table as measures are developed. And to states everywhere, including in the Pacific, we can't wait forever in terms of leveling the playing field. Third, the future is about protecting people and the planet as our fates are intertwined, and as you well know in your region. Environmental and human rights efforts are often siloed. This must change. Our integration of these issues is indispensable for a sustainable future. Fourth, we must return to a rights-centered approach, where rights holders and victims are the ones for whom we design policy, and in doing so include their voices, and ensure that they have access to effective remedy. Colleagues and friends, 16th of June 2021 will mark the 10th anniversary of the guiding principles. Their unanimous endorsement by the UN was a landmark moment for business respect for human rights, but also for better business. This is why in July of this year, we launched the UN Guiding Principles 10+ or Next Decade project. It will result in 2 main outputs. First, a stock-taking report will be presented to the UN Human Rights Council in June 2021, assessing achievements and failures to date. This will be the groundwork for the second part, where we will develop a roadmap for the next decade. The roadmap will be launched on the 16th of June. I am wondering whether a roadmap for the Pacific region is something that might be considered by states, business, and civil society as part of an agenda for action in the Pacific region. Very few states in the wider Asia Pacific have national action plans on business and human rights. I hope that the discussion here will pave the way for further and quick action from states to make policy commitments on this topic. I also hope that business will see the importance of sustainable markets needing to have the guiding principles as part of the recipe. And civil society, including human rights defenders and national human rights institutions, are critical partners to both governments and business in understanding impacts of economic activities on people. In closing, there's a fire raging. The world is burning. We are in the midst of fighting multiple crises, from climate change to economic meltdown to the raging inferno of a global pandemic, to the fiery scourge of racism. So if we can't make progress with respect to addressing how business engages in terms of respect for human rights as we attempt to rebuild, when can we? If we don't want to deploy tools of prevention in the future, we are doing ourselves to a world of future devastation. Thank you for the invitation. I hope that your discussions will be constructive, fruitful, and pave the way for further action in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. And it is now my pleasure to give the floor to the resident coordinator here in Fiji, Mr. Sanaka Samarasinha. You have the floor. Want to speak on the podium? Yeah, as you wish.
Is that all right? Sure. Okay, we'll keep it a bit informal. Thank you very much, Heike, and thank you certainly for giving me a few minutes to speak at this very important event. Honorable Attorney General, always good to sit next to you, although as I was half joking outside, you make me look bad when you're dressed so well and I'm not. But good to see you, Adri. And of course, my friends Alisi and as well as Emeline, it's good to be on the same panel with you both. Now, I wanted to just make a comment to start with. I, of course, am always given these notes, and then I try to figure out whether I should actually speak to my notes or should I actually speak from my heart. And so let me start with the heart and see how that goes, and if necessary, switch to the notes. When I look at these faces in front of me, I recognize many of them. And the thing is, I recognize you because I was a human rights person, so to speak, quote unquote, like Heike, for the last so many years. And 20 years ago, I started my human rights work here in the Pacific, here in Suva. And when I look at you and I think about human rights, you are the converted. So there's not a lot I can say to you in terms of preaching why it's important and what we should do, because you know it. Then my real question is, who should be here? And I think that in some ways says to us, we have not been able to convince some of the big business people in the community to be in the room with us. This happens all the time, not just when it comes to human rights. When we talk about any subject, it tends to be those who are specialized in that subject who come together. Well, business is not specialized in human rights, traditionally. It should be, but it's not. That they don't see human rights as being front and center. It's about the bottom line and profit margins and making sure that their shareholders are fine and they've created some jobs and they take some money home. So the question then is, how do we ensure that we find a space and start a conversation where we take into account that businesses do business and human rights, people like us do human rights, but the two need to come together. Now, first of all, clearly we need to hold businesses accountable. We started off about a decade and a half ago saying, at a minimum, businesses must do no harm. If you look around us and just walk out here to the seawall and you see all of the rubbish on the beach, where does that come from? Different types of businesses produce things, people purchase things, consume, and then the waste is disposed of in a highly unsustainable way that ends up impacting the human rights of all of us. How do we hold them accountable? Not just as governments, of course, government has a key role to play, but as consumers, as people, not just necessarily as human rights activists. You take the really serious issue of gender-based violence, violence against girls, boys, children, and we ask ourselves, what do businesses actually do within their businesses, if you're a big employer, to ensure that you, first of all, protect women in the workspaces? There is a good project that is being implemented around Fiji and in other parts of the Pacific called Markets for Change, where I've personally gone and visited, and I've found between the market managers, the local government, the UN, development partners like Australia and New Zealand, traders and others, have created safer spaces for women to work. How much more can and should be done when it comes to preventing gender-based violence, violence against girls and boys through business? The tuna industry is one of the biggest revenue earners for this part of the world. We've all heard horrendous stories of essentially slave labor, people who are held captive on boats, thrown overboard, children who are put on these boats. But of course, we don't think about that when we get that can of tuna off the shelf at a supermarket. So the real question is, how do we hold these businesses accountable? At least that's one of the real questions. The second is, how do we create incentives? And that's coming back to this whole business of, oh, not business, I'm using business way too much, but it comes back to this issue, this purchasing power that we have as consumers. So if we can create a sense of empowerment amongst those who engage with business, so that it's not just government, but we build the capacities of those who are actually giving those businesses the bottom line, the revenue that they need, to say, hang on a second, you can do that, but not at the cost of my future or the future of my children. Now, there was a mention of a national action plan, and I'm really very keen, AG, to consider after this event how we might be able to, Heike, bring some of the key business leaders, the chambers of commerce we were talking about briefly, to sit down together and have maybe even first an informal conversation and say, look, if maybe start with Fiji. As you know, we cover a number of countries in the Pacific, but Fiji is a good place to start. And perhaps we have them around the table and say, what are the steps? Talking about a roadmap, maybe it's a simple roadmap that we put together here in Fiji. You know, I've just come back this morning from the West, and we're planning a UN 75th anniversary community week in the West, with the final events in Prince Charles Park on the 11th and 12th of December. And over the last months, I've been talking to various businesses, just last night as well. And when I talk about building back better, they look at me and say, hang on a second, we're just trying to figure out how to survive. You know, we're trying to keep even the 10% of the staff we have on the payroll. And you're coming and talking to us about climate change and renewable energy and inclusive employment. Come on. So I think it's really important that we sit with them and work these things through, because as was said before, if not now, then when? Do we go back and build industries in the way it used to be pre-COVID, unsustainable and quite often industries that tended to violate people's human rights in one form or the other. Of course, in other ways, also help to fulfill people's human rights, because businesses are vital to ensuring that we have food to eat and we are able to take care of our families. So it's a conversation that needs to be had. I wanted to say, Heike, that we should bring together the entire UN system behind this initiative. It's a very important initiative. It clearly needs OHCHR leadership from the government. But if you are going to have a national action plan, we absolutely need to have the business leaders sitting with us, along with other members of the public and civil society. So count me in. And I hope I won't be saying the same thing in Suva 20 years from now. We would have seen a sea change, not in 20 years, but perhaps by next year. Thank you.
Very much, Sanaka, and thank you also for your pledge. So it is then my pleasure to pass the floor to Ms. Siale Ilolahia, who represents today and heads, in fact, the Pacific Island NGO Association. And you have the floor, madam. Would you like to speak from here or perhaps from the podium? There's a microphone just coming your way. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I start, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of the first UN Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights for inviting myself and to represent the Pacific Islands Associations of non-government organizations in the Pacific. Also acknowledge the panel, Honorable HG, representative of the UN in the Pacific, also my colleagues from the Pacific Islands private sector. It's quite an interesting issue that we still struggle with human rights issue in the Pacific, particularly in our region. And what we have observed working with, our communities, that sometimes the human rights speaks to individuals, individual rights, whereas our reality in how we live in our community, we live in a community or society where a lot of our rights are recognized as communal. Yeah, and you can relate to that, how we own land, how we see that there are communal ownerships. Yeah, we see how we live in our own family, kainga, our own family extended. Yeah, and so the issue of human rights is still an issue that I don't think that we had enough time that we invest in the process of having a good discussions, having good talanoa about it. And there's always been this argument that we had a civil society and government when we requested that there should be more consultation, there should be more talanoa about certain issues that related to our basic human rights. And then we are being told that there has been a number of meetings already conducted. Yeah, but I think that we had not really get down, the more talanoa that we had, the better, because there's a huge, a lot of things that we need to unpack around human rights issue in the Pacific. But more interesting so when it comes to business and human rights, yeah, because we have seen the UN guiding principles of the business and human rights that has been adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council back in June 2011, that speaks to 3 core pillars Yeah, first it speaks to the duty of the state, yeah, to protect human rights, which is fundamental. Let's say that the state's responsibility is to make sure that its citizens is protected, yeah, with the in terms of human rights. The second pillar is around the corporate responsibility of the businesses in terms to respect the human rights of the citizens of the country where they are operating. And the last one is access to remedy. Yeah. How do we make sure that our judicial system, our law, our regulations speaks to providing a remedial or remedy to those that are being affected, yeah, in the impact of any business practices that may lead to displacement of communities, you know, that may lead to negative impact on our natural resources, for example. And so some of those things that need to be in place by this piece of guiding principles that has been endorsed, adopted, approved, committed by some of our Pacific countries at the UN level. But I suppose the next question is really coming from civil societies, that how do we operationalize that, okay, so that it makes sense to us at the community level, at the country level, where we are looking and trusting our government to be leading, yeah, this work in terms of translating the guiding principles that has been with the 3 pillars that I've just briefly mentioned to our national system. Yeah, so that we feel comfortable that we don't have to really look out when there are business ventures coming usually from outside to do business in our country. Yeah, where we felt that we trust our government to protect us when there are business investments that are coming to do business in our communities or in our country. So this is really where PIANGO and our network of 24 countries in the Pacific, we have our presence in supporting national umbrella NGOs in those 24 countries and territories, where we would like to see a lot more of this support to build the capacity of our local people, build the capacity of civil society, build the capacity of our communities to understand this great piece of policy directions that has been adopted by the UN, and most of our countries in the Pacific is part of that system. Unfortunately, what we have seen that, and I don't want to repeat what the previous speakers have done, but I'd just like to pick a couple of things that we still find that we probably need to look further into that. One is consenting. Yeah? How do we make sure that in any of the business practices, business that are being introduced to our communities, really being embrace the consent of the community, particularly our indigenous communities. Yeah? Because what usually that we have seen is that it still comes with the context that one person, yeah, will make one decisions on behalf of our communities. Yeah? How do we make sure that how we translate our communal setting so that it's also reflect when we have to make a consensus decision-making process either by our own community or our own family, if it's related to a land that belongs to the family for how many years, yeah? How can we make sure that the environment that we do business protect the human rights of individuals, but at the same time, more so for our Pacific, recognize that our communal human rights in the way that we live in our communities. And we have seen the lack of understanding of the consenting being pushed by the interests of those that are coming to do business, yeah, with us. But the sad side of it is that we had not been recognizing the conflict that it has caused. Yeah, conflict between families, conflict within communities. More so when we're looking into our region, the conflict that still happen in countries. Yeah, and I will not do justice to my civil society communities if I cannot name a few, that a lot of our civil society recognize the conflict in West Papua, the conflict in New Caledonia, the conflict in Bougainville. If you dig deeper into that, it speaks to how we are dealing with business interest in our natural resources. Yeah? And I think we had not done enough in terms of how do we articulate that. Yeah? And I know that we don't have enough time, but what COVID-19 has taught us, yeah, in my own reflection, is that our resilience is really speaks to the primary resources that we have in our region: agriculture, our land, our ocean. Yeah. Unfortunately, this is the main industry that a lot of the business interests are at, yeah, in our region. And so if we are to talk about building back better, this is where we probably need to talk a lot more about how do we see that our resilience, our foundation of our resilience speaks to our natural resources, and how much of our community are part of that decision-making, of that consenting into that kind of work. And the corporate capture is one of the issues, a huge elephant that we may not be able to articulate further, but it's something that we need to start talking about. So if I am to suggest, what can we do? And one of the things that we had recognized is that since the adoptions of the UN guiding principles, there are two things that the UN had proposed that we need to look into. And we understand any systemic change need to happen. We need to have a systemic change within our own system, right? That's a sustainable change that I think that we need to also recognize. The first one is having a national human rights institution established at the national level. Yeah? And maybe this is where I'm probably looking at the Honorable SHE to see if Fiji could lead this kind of work, because in our region, we only have 3 countries that has a national human rights institution: Fiji, Samoa, and Tuvalu. But then this is where we start to look into, where do you see institutions within our own country to take up the 3 pillars that have been identified in the guiding principles. And the other one is the national action plans that the previous speakers have speak to. What we from civil society like to call on government to articulate more in terms of having the national human rights institution in place, because that would mean that our countries will have to concentrate in establishing a national action plan. And why civil society is so keen to have this? Because it will provide a common platform where civil society, private sector, and our communities and our government will be coming together to go design what it may look like in terms of how do we want to see ourselves moving forward. My last point is that it has been recognized by the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review of the UN. A lot of other Pacific countries had civil society had called on their government to have the national institutions on human rights, and that's an area there where we are still lacking here in our regions, and hope that our 3 countries that have already taken the lead in that can guide us into influencing our other Pacific countries to do a lot more of work in that. There's a lot of work that we do at civil society before that we often stand alone to advocate for change against government, against business, yeah, in terms of how we lobby, how we push for. My final take is that this UN guiding principles is a great opportunity to provide a common platform where we all could come together and see what we can do to move the agenda of business and human rights forward. Minaka.
Inaka, thank you very much. And I'd like to give the floor now to the next speaker, Alisi Tuqa from the Pacific Islands Private Sector Organization. I hope your microphone is working now. Yes, very good. You have the floor. Thank you so much.
Hello, good morning, everyone. With all protocols observed, firstly, Misambula Vinaka, and good morning to everyone here, as well as those online. I think let's not forget there are people connected online. I wanted to take the opportunity to thank the United Nations team here in Suva for affording me the opportunity to be part of this esteemed panel this morning and to be part of this important event, the first ever UN Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights. This opening panel and plenary is about promoting responsible business conduct and in the Pacific. And I wanted to acknowledge the speakers who've come before me for their insights and intervention. That's a good thing about going at the tail end. You can sort of edit your speech because some of the content have been said already. No doubt to have this conversation around business and human rights, be it more about the technical aspects of issues, resourcing capacities, which Siale had talked about. We have to involve, obviously, the private sector, whom I represent here this morning. But before that, let me diverge for a moment. I think, firstly, in a way, to remind us and to get us to reflect on what the Pacific private sector looks like here in this region, to put that into context and to reflect on who we are, and when we are talking about working in human rights particularly, because that is a massive area in itself. What that really means and what it will entail, particularly for those partners who are providing technical assistance and resourcing. And as you consider thinking about how to work with the business community in the Pacific. Firstly, that the characteristics of the Pacific private sector is unique in that we are a developing region, and therefore our private sector is largely made up of small to medium enterprises. Secondly, that we also have a very big informal sector, with many individuals participating in various economic enterprising activities. And majority of these individuals are women, and where they do not have much protection of the law, often subject to harassment, cannot access finance so easily, and have difficulties, for example, entering into enforceable contracts. And of course, there are many other challenges that face them. We also have small industries and are reliant on a handful of sectors, mainly tourism, and I guess the supporting and spin-off businesses, fisheries and agriculture, for example. And I think no better time have we seen this dependency and the stress that it is associated to than during this year, during this pandemic. The private sector, like all those around the world, are employers. They are providers of goods and services, and what I like to call agents of change, which again, Siale reflected on, is about investing innovation, communities, particularly through corporate social responsibility. And when we talk about the private sector in the Pacific, that we're not only talking about business entities, about companies, that we're including supporting networks like the board of directors, their shareholders, staff, chambers of commerce, employer organizations, trade unions, and so on. The perception and negative stereotype, which I think we've heard on from quite a few speakers this morning, that when you think and talk about business and human rights, you immediately think of the sweatshops in foreign countries, for example, where child labor and unsafe working conditions are commonplace. But we also know that private sector development, when done properly, provides broad-based business activity. It builds skills and innovation, brings about opportunities and decent livelihoods for individuals and communities. But we also know that there are other issues and challenges that we need to address, such as exploitative conditions, health and safety standards, pollution and environmental degradation, for example. Over the years, the Pacific private sector, when it came to addressing human rights issues, have focused at the national level, mainly because a lot of the work is around compliance and because you're bound by national law and policies. And a lot of this from our sector particularly has been private sector as the employer. So looking and focusing on labor laws, for example, employment relations and workers' rights, and interfacing with governments and workers' representation, for example. But in recent years, that focus has shifted, and I say that from a regional perspective, and with the knowledge that our members, particularly the PIPSO members, recognize the importance of a more collective approach to human rights. And a lot of this work has been built on partnerships and collaboration, and I'd especially like to thank all our partners who worked with us over the last few years on this. And truth be told, when you talk to private sector and businesses, they are busy operating their businesses and trying to stay in business, and human rights usually is at the tail end of a lot of their discussions. So it's important for them to participate in private sector industry, bodies and associations and collectives. So I just wanted to take this opportunity for the next few minutes just to highlight 3 areas that some of the good things the Pacific private sector have been doing, and to highlight some of that collaboration and partnerships that we've been working on, and lots of shared learning. One is around advancing gender equality. I think a few of the speakers have already spoke of that. Of course, we all know that research shows that ensuring women are afforded with equal opportunities and pay in the workplace, for example, has sound business case. According to estimates by the IMF, for example, the underutilization of female labor workforce can cost you up to about 30% of your GDP in some regions, not all. And while government policies can be helpful in addressing a lot of these gender gaps in economic participation, a big role is also upon the private sector, who can address more the structural inequalities. And that's really around workplace policies and resourcing that's available to companies and businesses to address gender equality and participation. Last year, we partnered with DFAT, the Australian government, the British High Commission and UN Women, and launched the UN's Women's Empowerment Principles here in Fiji to promote more pragmatic guidelines for gender equality for businesses. And in fact, several Fiji businesses signed up to that. While that focused on Fiji, we're now looking to next year to roll out that work to our members across the Pacific. We've also seen members working on other specific issues, example, the business case for workplace responses to domestic and sexual violence in Fiji, which has been led by IFC, working directly with our member here in Fiji, which is the Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation, as well as with other private sector groups like the Fiji Human Resource Institute. Women in business chapters in our national private sector organizations have also been taking the lead in particular campaigns and issues to lobby and advocate issues affecting women at the workplace, like the Women Entrepreneurs Business Council here in Fiji, as well as the PNG Women's Chamber of Commerce, for example. The second issue that some of my members have been working on over the years is around anti-corruption. And this started back in 2017, again through collaboration and partnership with UN PRAC. And they worked specifically with our members to develop codes of conduct, and then based on what individual needs that were coming from our members, to customize those specific technical assistance to them. Many companies have developed and implemented anti-corruption compliance programs because they are based on national law, and particularly if you're aligned to companies that are based outside of the region, and to be able to get you to prevent and detect and of course respond to corruption throughout the operations. Anti-corruption compliance is a complex issue, but it also addresses more widely issues such as money laundering, for example, antitrust, environmental protection, of course, worker safety. And we promote this quite widely in PIPSO as a risk mitigation tool and as a means to embed ethical values into corporate culture. Because every day, and more so now more than ever, is customers and clients are more knowledgeable and have greater access to information, and so want companies and businesses to demonstrate and know and show compliance to human rights standards and throughout their operations. I also go back to FCEF, the Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation, as an example. Just a few months ago, they set up a modern day slavery subcommittee to create awareness amongst its members about modern slavery. In 2018, the Australian government passed this as an act, And the consequences of this legislation will affect the Pacific region, and particularly as they work with suppliers and contractors. And so there will be that impact for businesses to make sure they are following and adhering to these policies and laws. So this is one piece of work that's being led by one member, but with obviously a lot more shared learning and opportunities across the Pacific region. And lastly, just to touch on climate change, I think it's now beyond dispute that climate change caused by human activity has negative impacts on the full enjoyment of all our human rights, and has profound impacts on particularly us in the Pacific region. The private sector is increasingly getting engaged, and I think over the years we've been participating in, for example, the CAP, which have been organized by the Fiji government, the COP23 and other processes, and the implementation of the framework for resilient development in the Pacific. PIPSO and 3 other private sector organizations in the region are actively involved in the Pacific Resilience Partnership Task Force, making sure that private sector perspectives are captured in these discussions, which include talking with governments, academia, and development partners. And it's not just talking about access to finance and resourcing, but the impacts across migration and localization, displacement, impacts on resources, maritime boundaries, and so on. And in fact, some of our members have also set up business resilience councils in their membership. Example, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa to do just that. And to this end, I think I'll wrap up, and I'd like to close with a quote from the former UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, who said, "Our challenge is to make sure that business is not part of the problem, but a source of solutions. Human rights must be respected at every step of production." And on that note, I thank you, and we at PIPSO look forward to working with you all. Naka.
Very much. And it is now my great pleasure to pass the floor to our keynote speaker, the Honorable Attorney General and Minister for the Economy, Mr. Aiyaz Sayed-Khaiyum. Yes, please go ahead.
You know, there's a saying that he who speaks last must speak the least, because more wiser than them have spoken before him. So the UN resident coordinator, the regional rep for the Pacific OHCR, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I was in this room here yesterday evening. The room was full of people. It was organized by the Fiji Chamber of Commerce to talk about various issues pertaining to businesses and how they're running and what are the challenges they're facing. And I wish we had the same type of people also included here in the room today to what Sanaka was actually saying regarding this. Because really, if we are to get some traction in this space, we really need to engage with the private sector and more businesses more directly. And I think I'd like to, again, just talk off the cuff regarding some of the key issues. Sometimes the discussions of human rights, in particular when you have, for example, businesses and human rights advocates, there's a very dichotomous approach and sometimes even antagonistic approach that's taken. And a lot of it, I think, stems from the fact that there's a lack of understanding of the issues that each group may face, or the importance of the issues that they place as far as their paradigm is concerned. And that paradigm shift is critically important if you are to get some traction. We, of course, are discussing human rights and businesses in the context of a pandemic. Pandemic which essentially brought the world to a standstill. Fiji, for example, has lost its tourism sector. We do not have any tourists coming into Fiji. When you had 40% of its GDP completely reliant on the tourism sector, directly and indirectly, it has enormous impact, enormous socioeconomic impact. People have become unemployed, there are lesser hours that they're working, and obviously it has a spillover effect on those who are in the ancillary services. In the same way that lady who may be selling boiled, EV to People used to work at Fiji Airways or the airport, or outside some hotel. The workers used to come out and buy boiled evi, or the lady selling mitai. Nobody's buying it from her. Those ladies have gone out of business. It's a very practical level, it affects them. Of course, globally, if you look at it, a lot of businesses are struggling. Governments overseas, in particular the developed world, the developed governments are pumping in literally trillions of dollars. What do you call quantitative easing? People essentially are printing money. I was reading an article yesterday where UK has never had such an economic contraction since 1700s. They have not borrowed as much since World War II. So there are new norms being set. The whole issue about how governments, have a more flexible fiscal approach in respect of managing the economies, in respect of borrowing, and how we actually look at borrowing now by sovereign is critically important. And indeed, the new paradigms are being created altogether. Amidst all of this, of course, is that you have people who are dying. The Spanish flu, 50 million people died. The world is completely different about 100 years ago. Today, the world is a lot more interdependent. We have global, supply chains. All of these new, dynamics are now in 2020. They did not exist 100 years ago. The world is a lot more greatly dependent. Fiji did not get nearly 1 million tourists in 1900. In fact, we probably did not have a tourism industry. So you see, the world has changed dramatically. And it's within this context that we're also talking about human rights and businesses. If you talk about businesses, you cannot paint all businesses with one brush. As has been mentioned, that there are many small businesses. They're struggling businesses. The lady who's selling EV, that's her business too. She may actually be employing 2 people to boil the EV for her. She's also providing a little bit of business to the guy who may bring her on the carrier to wherever she's going, say in Nandi or Suva. So in fact, some statistics actually demonstrate that there's about 130,000 Fijians engaged in what we call the informal sector. And then of course there are those who are in the formal sector, but not necessarily large businesses. Some figures say that nearly 50 to 60% of all business in Fiji are actually very small. What we call micro, small, medium enterprises. There's a guy who's down the road, he's got 3 people working for him, and they fix your tire when it's punctured. That's his business. There may be a lady who may be making fried fish and cassava and selling to carriers that stop by in Navua. These are all types of small businesses, and they're not necessarily creating pollution directly. May not be like another business. I can give you an example. Last week, Department of Environment, or Ministry of Environment, I should say, essentially gave a stop work order to a factory that employs about 300 people. They've been polluting the one river in Lamy. Now, COVID-19, 125,000 people have lost jobs or may have reduced hours. And here's the Department of Environment telling a factory, if you don't comply with this particular environmental directive, we'll have to shut you down. Now, the river is floating with a lot of grease and fat and all sort of untreated discharge. But then somebody can come running along, as they did, and say, look, 300 people won't have their jobs for the next few days. So it's not very easy. It's easy to criticize. It's easy to say, well, yes, X, Y, Z must happen, but you also need to be able to put it into context. Sometimes hard choices need to be made. And one would hope in this particular instance, of course, he erred on the side of ensuring there is environmental compliance, because there was lack of compliance for a long period of time. But try explaining that to the 300 people who may not necessarily get paid in the next 2 weeks. So you see, those are the kind of dynamics that's at play. In the same way, in the COVID-19 situation, we've of course had a lot of people who've been affected, and they can of course fall through the cracks. This is why government in the budget has appropriated $100 million, 95 of which will be $95 million will be to provide direct unemployment assistance. And we are finding on a daily basis that a lot more people are becoming a lot more dependent on that, because they could access their general account in FNPF. But as those amounts actually start depleting, a lot more of them are getting the 220 a fortnight from government. Now that obviously needs to continue, and that's essential because people can actually fall through the cracks. They can fall into a poverty trap. We also at the same time have issues, for example, some months back, as I mentioned to the group here yesterday, that when, with the program of Love Your Locals, people can go in now, stay at all these fantastic hotels which they never could stay at because now the rates are a lot cheaper. A lot of the staff did not want to come to work because they said, if we come and work for Saturday and Sunday, maybe we'll lose the 220 that we're getting through FNPF or through government. So we then made an announcement and said, okay, you must go and work, you will still get your 220 a fortnight, even if you go and work on a weekend, and even if they pay you on top of the 220. Why did we do that? It was because we did not want these people to lose their trade, their profession, their skill sets. Because once the borders open, then of course, tourists will come and we want these people to be still trained. They still need to be able to work and carry out their work effectively and efficiently. So those are the kind of dynamics that's at play at the moment. And of course, talking about COVID-19, one of the main issues now, I think, is a global issue, and it will become a human rights issue, and it is access to vaccines. If, for example, your travel will now be determined by you actually getting a vaccine, and if you don't get access to that, it becomes a huge problem. The richer countries in the world have already prepaid many of the pharmaceutical companies and said, once the vaccine comes out, you give it to us first. And what about us little fellas and fallies in the Pacific, in the smaller countries? So we've, of course, had been on the international fora, whether we're talking to the World Bank, whether we're talking to IMF, whether we're talking to the UN, whether we're talking to our bilateral partners, whether it's UK, Australia, New Zealand. We've said that we need to ensure that vaccine is treated actually as a social good, not purely as a commodity, because it actually relates to, human survivability, accessibility to jobs, accessibility to economic participation in the global economy. So those are the kind of issues that we are actually balancing, and human rights is very much dependent on that. And we are glad that countries like, for example, Australia have said that they will try and provide accessibility to Pacific Island countries and put us on top of the ladder, because we need to be on the top of the ladder. You should not be restricted by your size, nor should you actually be punished for your success. We are the only country in the world, I would venture to say at this point in time, where we have over 220 days without any active COVID cases in the community. We are very lucky, of course. It makes our case a lot easier to argue with the rest of the world when we want to open up our tourism sector, for example, vis-a-vis the Bula bubble, etc. I think the other point that I wanted to make was in respect of some of the issues that were raised about, the issue about communal approach to rights. I think the UN minority, the Committee on Minority Rights has dealt with this quite, I think, effectively and significantly. It does not mean because we have communal ownership of rights that therefore that there should be no protection. We have the Human Rights Commission, and more importantly, you need a Bill of Rights. Many countries in the Pacific actually don't have a strong Bill of Rights. In the Fijian Constitution, you have a Bill of Rights that recognizes a vast array of rights, in particular based on the notion of non-discrimination, even based on your culture. And you have various protections built into the Constitution itself. I think, but that does not in any way negate an individual's right to be able to exercise those individual rights. There's no contradiction, if you like, from that perspective. I think the other issue that we have to talk about also is when you have social dislocation, in particular brought about by economic changes, people do tend to get very parochial. There's a lady from I don't know which city she was in the States, but she talked about, for example, the rise of racism globally, and the rise to move to the right globally we've seen. A lot of it is to do with the economic dislocation, and people provide very simple solutions to very complex issues. And so communalism tends to become, a simple solution, and the them and us begins to get developed. And I think that's something that we need to be quite, we need to be alerted to, and indeed be mindful that does not creep into our assessment of human rights and into our consideration of the applicability of the UN human rights as a right applicable to all individuals in our society. Climate change, of course, is very, very significant for all of us. We are the cold face of climate change. The Pacific Island countries is highlighted by Alisi, in respect of, for example, you have an inundation of seawater that not only takes up land, but also it can have an impact on your ability to measure your EEZs. We have a climate change bill currently in the public space in Fiji. And if you look at the climate change bill, and I hope all of you have looked at it, if you haven't, please do so. It's available online and you can make your submissions. It also puts a particular level of responsibility on companies and the ability to participate in the climate change space. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that climate change actually is a very insidious way that it encroaches upon your rights on a daily basis. And a lot of people don't necessarily, I think, recognize the enormity of it. Pandemics actually gets very good media, because it's all over the place. And it's very much at the, your first news item on television. But climate change is not necessarily the first, news item piece on television. It's not necessarily the first news item piece on CNN or BBC. It may come when there's a COP, and then they all sort of forget about it. Whereas we are the cold face of climate change. We have 43 villages that need to be relocated to higher ground. Otherwise they'll, disappear. The land will disappear. There's enormous impact in terms of cultural considerations, your ability to access food, your ability to access various services. I think within all of this, one of the issues that I found, and I think I was in some discussion in one of the forums I think it was in New York or Washington, we also tend to, in a way, romanticize the past. Somebody was saying to me, well, we're all very resilient, and back in 1800s or 1700s, we still had cyclones in the Pacific, and our people survived it. Well, actually, it was very different. There were far less cyclones in that point in time. The frequency and the intensity of it was much reduced. However, there are very basic things that you now consider human rights that weren't rights then. Access to electricity, access to reticulated water systems, access to bridges, to roads, access to schools. Those did not exist 300-400 years ago in the Pacific. Now, if you don't get electricity after a cyclone, people get annoyed by that. If you don't get access to road, if you don't get access to a reticulated water system, people get annoyed by this. My rights are being infringed. And indeed, they would be correct in saying that, because the Fijian constitution says every Fijian has a right to accessible and portable water, drinking water. So you see, we have to be able to contextualize rights. There's no point in sort of harking back to the past. There are, of course, very positive things in the past in respect of, for example, biodiversity, the traditional knowledge. A lot of it has been lost. A lot of it needs to be rescued. A lot of it needs to be documented. Now, so that is being done. But we have to ensure that we are able to deal with each of these matters on its own merit. There's not a holistic or whole sinker approach to everything in the past is fantastic and everything in the present is bad. So I think a lot more smarter way, if we take that approach, then your ability, getting back to the topic of the day, getting the businesses engaged, would be a lot more fruitful if you have a more nuanced approach to it. If we are able to distinguish between those businesses that are doing the right thing, or who are willing to actually participate in this space, and how we can bring them along. Recognizing that there are businesses that actually face their own problems and issues, and how we can actually help them mitigate that. And of course, to be able to demonstrate to them that if you are able to, participate in this space, there may be commercial benefits for you. In the same way we say to businesses that if you have, sustainability built into your businesses, you actually have longevity in respect of your profits. You're able to have a very deeply embedded approach to longevity regarding your businesses. I remember saying about 7, 8 years ago at a tourism forum when we had first introduced the Domestic Violence Act, the first time that it was ever done in Fiji. And I said to businesses, you actually have to be able to participate in this space, but more, at the very least recognize that if bulk of your workers or your employees, for example, tourism sector, are women who wait at the tables, who come and clean the rooms, who are at the reception, and if they are being bashed up at home the night before, purely from a commercial perspective, what would be the productivity rate the next day at work? What would be the rate of absenteeism? Purely from that perspective. So you cannot say that businesses don't get into the private space. Businesses need to get into the private space, because if you don't have an appreciation of what is actually happening in the private space, that have enormous impact on your business, enormous impact on the productivity levels of your business. If you go to, for example, Levuka, PEFCO, I think about 80 to 90% of all the workers, your canned fish that you get, are women. There are 2 shifts. There's over 1,000 people there. Probably about 850 of them are women. Now, if there is domestic violence, if PEFCO is not able to deal with that and participate in that space, then of course the productivity levels of those workers will be actually very much reduced. So I think, we have to bring along people in these spaces, including in the business community. I think the last point that I'd like to make is that we talked about corruption. And most definitely, we need to be able to address corruption. And a lot of the times there's a lot of focus on what we call corruption between the state and a private business. And of course, you have organizations like FICAC, that's why it was specifically created, to try and stop systemic corruption. But believe you me, there's a lot of corruption in the private sector itself. It does not involve the state. So if I'm for example, a procurement officer in a hotel, and my job is to procure goods from a hardware company, and I don't necessarily do the tendering correctly. They may not do tendering correctly, but people pay a lot more higher price because somebody's being paid under the table. So there is also corruption within the private sector itself that needs to be addressed. And I think you can bring those values to that too. The other important point I think about corruption, which I've seen, I think needs to be addressed quite significantly, is to do with the judiciary. There is a very, I think the judiciary, in particular, including in countries like Fiji and other Pacific Island countries, the jurisprudence regarding corruption in Fiji and other Pacific Island countries is not very highly developed. And I can give you a number of examples of recent cases where people, in some other jurisdiction like UK, like Australia, or like Hong Kong, they've actually been convicted because the jurisprudence in those countries have actually developed. But because some of the members of the judiciary in Fiji are actually applying jurisprudence probably from the 1950s and 60s and have not necessarily applying the same principles as are being applied in other jurisdictions, we are seeing that the development of the law is actually very slow. And therefore, your ability to successfully prosecute and get the deterrence built into a modern day economy, we're actually lagging behind. And that's something I hope that the judiciary can actually come up to speed with regarding corruption. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to, of course, thank the UN for organizing this. The pandemic, of course, has brought about a number of, highly significant challenges for everybody, including socioeconomic challenges. Of course, as we know that even the simple example that I've used in the tourism sector, majority of the workers in the tourism sector, the frontline workers are women. There's a disproportionate effect on women, as we find this disproportionate effect on women, for example, whenever we have climate crisis also. And we need to be able to address those fundamental issues. But I please would urge that in the next couple of days, that when you are having these discussions, to be able to reach out to a number of organizations from the private sector if we are to actually seriously going to address the issue of human rights in businesses. Sanaka, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Attorney General, Minister for the Economy. So this concludes, in fact, our opening panel. And I think you have given us a number of food for thought just before our tea break here. I'd like to invite everyone out to the foyer, and our colleagues, friends, listeners, and everyone online. We will start again at 11:15 with the next session that my colleagues will introduce. And thank you all for coming and attending the opening of our first Pacific Business and Human Rights Forum.